There are experiences that do not fit neatly inside the limits of ordinary explanation. Moments that arrive without warning, yet reshape everything you thought you understood about life, death, and what lies beyond. Most people try to dismiss such things quickly, either as imagination or coincidence, because taking them seriously forces questions that are uncomfortable to carry. But there are moments that resist dismissal, not because they are dramatic, but because they carry a weight of certainty that does not fade with time. What I am about to describe began in one of those moments, in the quiet of a rectory in the American Midwest, where nothing about the environment suggested anything unusual was about to happen. A priest I had known for 7 years had died suddenly, at the age of 61, without warning and without illness, taken by a heart attack that ended his life in a single day. There was no preparation, no gradual decline, only the abrupt reality of absence, where presence had been just hours before. I attended his funeral like anyone else would, offered prayers for his soul, and continued with my responsibilities, assuming grief would follow its usual course. 11 days later, nothing suggested that anything had changed in the natural order of things, until I woke suddenly at around 3 in the morning. It was not a slow awakening or a dreamlike transition, but the kind of instant alertness that happens when something in the environment itself feels different. In that moment, there was a presence in the room, not visible, not physical, and not something that could be captured by any normal means of observation. Yet it was unmistakable in its clarity, the same way you recognize another person standing near you without needing to see them directly. What made it even more distinct was not just presence, but identity, because I recognized exactly who it was. It was the priest who had died 11 days earlier. There was no visual form, no sound, and no external sign that anything had entered the room, but the awareness of him was immediate and precise. It carried a quality that was not neutral or abstract, but deeply specific, as though the presence itself communicated a condition rather than words. That condition was need. It was not peace, not rest, and not the kind of comforting absence people often imagine after death. It was a focused, urgent awareness that something was unresolved, and that help was being sought in a way that could not be fulfilled by the one who needed it. That realization did not come through thought or interpretation, but through direct recognition. I got out of bed immediately and knelt to pray. There was no hesitation, no attempt to analyze what was happening in the moment. Only the immediate response that prayer was required. By morning, I had already arranged for 30 masses to be offered for his soul, known in tradition as the Gregorian Masses, beginning as soon as possible. What matters here is not only the experience itself, but the framework required to understand it without falling into confusion. Because without that framework, people are left with only 2 options: dismiss it entirely or interpret it incorrectly. Neither option reflects what the Catholic tradition has actually taught about the relationship between the living and the dead. The Church has never been silent on what happens after death, even if modern practice often leaves that silence unaddressed in pastoral life. At the moment of death, the soul separates from the body and immediately enters what theology calls the particular judgment. This judgment is not delayed or partial, but complete and definitive before God. The soul then moves toward its final state, whether that is heaven, hell, or purification, depending on its condition before God. This teaching has been consistently articulated in Catholic theology, including by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, who emphasize the immediacy and completeness of the soul's judgment after death. But what is often overlooked is that the soul, though no longer bound to the body, still exists within God's providential order, and its relationship to the living is not necessarily erased in an instant. The tradition holds that under certain conditions, particularly in the case of souls undergoing purification, there can be a form of proximity between the dead and the living that serves a specific spiritual purpose. This is not superstition, and it is not the popular idea of ghosts or wandering spirits. It is a theological concept rooted in the communion of saints, carefully distinguished from any form of spiritism or unauthorized contact with the dead. When such proximity occurs, it is never for curiosity or control, but always oriented toward prayer, intercession, and divine mercy. And this is where the modern world often loses the framework entirely, because without proper teaching, these realities are either ignored or misinterpreted in ways that disconnect them from the sacramental life of the Church. In the next part, I will explain how the Church distinguishes between authentic spiritual presence and deception, why discernment is essential in these experiences, and what the tradition teaches about how the living should respond when they encounter something that appears to cross the boundary between this world and the next. What makes experiences like this so difficult to interpret is not the absence of meaning, but the presence of too many possible interpretations competing at once. Human beings are quick to fill uncertainty with either skepticism or imagination, and both reactions can distort reality in different ways. The Catholic tradition takes a different approach, one rooted in discernment rather than reaction. Because of that, the first question that must always be addressed is not whether something felt real, but whether it can be understood within a coherent theological framework. The Church has never treated the boundary between this world and the next as a closed system, but neither has it treated it as something open to human manipulation or curiosity. Instead, it has always insisted on careful distinction between what is permitted by God and what is not. This is where the teaching of figures such as Thomas Aquinas becomes essential, because he approaches the question of spiritual presence with strict categories rather than emotional assumptions. In his analysis, not every perceived presence of the dead is actually the soul of the dead person. Some experiences may involve divine permission, while others may involve purely spiritual deception. Aquinas outlines that if a departed soul is made known to the living, it is never through its own independent power, but always under the governance of God. That means any authentic presence is not self-initiated by the soul, but allowed for a specific purpose within divine providence. This immediately removes the idea that the dead roam freely or act independently in the world of the living. At the same time, the tradition acknowledges that there are other possible sources of perceived presence. Angelic beings can be involved in mediating communication, and in some cases, deceptive spiritual forces can imitate the appearance or knowledge of a deceased person. This is not presented as speculation, but as a serious theological warning repeated across centuries of pastoral teaching. Because of this, discernment becomes absolutely central. The Church does not encourage passive acceptance of every experience, nor does it allow automatic dismissal. Instead, it establishes criteria that allow the faithful to test what they are experiencing against the truth of doctrine and the fruit it produces in the soul. The first and most important criterion is doctrinal consistency. Any experience that leads a person away from prayer, away from the sacraments, or away from moral clarity cannot be considered a genuine communication from a holy source. The reason is simple: God does not contradict himself, and no authentic divine action will undermine the faith it is meant to strengthen. The second criterion is spiritual fruit. Genuine encounters that involve the souls of the departed, when permitted by God, do not produce curiosity or fascination. Instead, they produce urgency toward prayer, repentance, and sacramental life. The response is not investigation, but intercession. This distinction is critical because it separates Catholic understanding from both superstition and modern psychological reductionism. One treats every experience as supernatural contact, while the other dismisses every experience as internal projection. The Church rejects both extremes in favor of disciplined discernment. The third criterion concerns behavior. The correct response to any perceived presence of the dead is never to engage it as an equal or to seek information from it. The proper response is always directed upward, toward God, through prayer for the soul in question. This alone defines the boundary between legitimate spiritual awareness and forbidden spiritual practice. This is also why the Church has consistently condemned Spiritism in all its forms, including attempts to communicate with the dead through human initiative. Practices such as seances or mediumship are not condemned because the dead cannot be real, but because human beings are not permitted to initiate contact across that boundary. The danger lies in the direction of the movement. When the living attempt to reach the dead on their own terms, they step outside the order established by divine providence. In that space, the tradition warns, deception becomes not only possible but likely, because it replaces receptive faith with controlling curiosity. What I experienced at 3 in the morning must therefore be understood within this framework. The presence itself did not invite dialogue, questions, or investigation. It produced something far simpler and more demanding, the immediate awareness that prayer was required. There was no message in words, no symbolic imagery, and no invitation to interact. There was only a clarity of need, and that clarity directed everything toward prayer without hesitation or analysis. That response is important because it aligns with what the tradition identifies as the proper movement of the soul in such moments. The response was not to seek understanding through communication, but to act through intercession. That is the defining difference between Catholic discernment and every form of spiritual curiosity that moves beyond its proper limits. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Catholic teaching on death is the assumption that everything happens in a single moment, with no unfolding process that matters afterward. While the Church is clear that the particular judgment is immediate, it has never taught that the experience of transition is psychologically or spiritually uniform in the way modern imagination often assumes. There is, within the tradition, a consistent recognition that what follows death involves stages of adjustment, purification, and orientation toward the final state of the soul. This is why the Church has preserved not only theological language, but also devotional patterns that reflect a layered understanding of time after death. The focus is not on delay in judgment, but on the unfolding of the soul's relationship to what has already been revealed in that judgment. In other words, what is immediate in verdict is still experienced in a way that involves process within the order of divine providence. This is where references to periods such as 3 days, 9 days, and 40 days begin to appear repeatedly across both Western mystical tradition and Eastern Christian practice. These are not arbitrary numbers, nor are they intended as mechanical timelines imposed on the afterlife. They function instead as symbolic and spiritual markers that reflect consistent patterns of prayer, memory, and liturgical practice within the life of the Church. In the Eastern Christian tradition, especially within Orthodox practice, memorial prayers for the dead are often offered on the 3rd day, the 9th day, and the 40th day after death. These intervals are not treated as magical thresholds, but as spiritually meaningful points that correspond to stages in the soul's transition and the Church's intercessory role during that transition. The 3rd day is often associated with the remembrance of Christ's own resurrection on the 3rd day, connecting the departed soul's journey with the central mystery of Christian hope. It marks a transition from immediate separation into a more stabilized awareness of the new state of existence. The 9th day, in turn, is frequently linked with angelic orders and the broader spiritual hierarchy described in traditional theology. Then comes the 40th day, which carries even greater symbolic weight across the entire biblical tradition. In Scripture, 40 is repeatedly used to indicate periods of transition, testing, and transformation, such as the 40 days of the flood, the 40 years in the desert, and the 40 days Christ spent in the wilderness. These patterns are not accidental repetitions, but theological rhythms embedded in salvation history. The same pattern appears in the interval between Christ's resurrection and ascension, which also spans 40 days. Within this framework, the 40th day after death is understood in many traditions as a moment of completion in the transitional phase of the soul's proximity to earthly life. It does not mean the soul ceases to receive prayer, but that its mode of relation to the earthly realm shifts in a noticeable way. What is important to understand is that the tradition is not describing physical movement in space, but relational orientation within a spiritual order. The soul is not traveling through geography, but moving through states of purification and clarity in relation to God. Any language of proximity must therefore be understood analogically, not materially. Within this understanding, early post-death periods are consistently described by mystical writers as moments of heightened spiritual responsiveness. This does not mean the soul is unstable or confused in a psychological sense, but that it is especially receptive to the prayers, sacrifices, and masses offered by the Church on its behalf. This is where the urgency of early intercession becomes theologically significant. The Church has never defined a limit after which prayer becomes ineffective. On the contrary, it teaches that prayer for the dead remains always efficacious because it participates in the eternal merit of Christ's sacrifice. However, it does distinguish between urgency of need and permanence of benefit. The earlier period is described as one in which the need is more acute, and therefore the response of charity is more immediately impactful. This is why devotional practices such as novenas for the dead, especially the 9-day prayer cycles rooted in apostolic tradition, developed within the life of the Church. These practices reflect not superstition, but pastoral awareness of how the faithful naturally respond to death when properly formed in prayer. They provide structure for sustained intercession during the early phase after death. In parallel, Western mystical tradition, while less systematically structured than Eastern practice in this area, repeatedly emphasizes the importance of immediate prayer after death. Saints and spiritual writers often encourage offering masses, prayers, and sacrifices as soon as possible after a person dies, precisely because this period is seen as spiritually significant in terms of responsiveness to grace. This is where the Gregorian Masses become especially important. Associated with the tradition surrounding Pope Gregory the Great, these Masses consist of 30 consecutive liturgical celebrations offered for a single deceased person. The number 30 itself is not arbitrary, but reflects a sustained period of intercession modeled on historical and biblical patterns of structured prayer. The theological foundation of this practice rests on the understanding that the Mass is not merely symbolic remembrance, but the real participation in the sacrifice of Christ. Therefore, when Mass is offered for the dead, it applies the infinite merit of that sacrifice to the specific intention of the soul in question. The repetition over time expresses sustained charity rather than increasing efficacy. Within this framework, the idea of timing does not mean that God is constrained by human scheduling. Rather, it reflects the way human beings participate in divine grace within time. The urgency of early prayer is about the responsiveness of love, not the limitation of divine power. God is not restricted, but human participation is meaningfully ordered. This distinction becomes essential when discussing experiences like the one I described earlier. If a presence is perceived in the early period after death, the proper theological interpretation is not fascination with timing, but recognition of responsibility. The response is not analysis of the phenomenon, but immediate intercession for the soul in question. It is also important to clarify that nothing in this teaching implies that the soul is wandering or suspended in uncertainty. The Church is clear that the particular judgment determines the soul's final orientation immediately. What develops afterward is not uncertainty about destiny, but the unfolding of purification within that determined state. This is why any interpretation that treats these experiences as ghostly activity or unresolved wandering consciousness fails to align with Catholic doctrine. It reduces a structured theological reality to something vague and uncontrolled, which is precisely what the Church has always rejected in both superstition and spiritualism. At the same time, reducing everything to psychological projection also fails, because it eliminates the sacramental and intercessory dimension entirely. The Church's position is neither denial nor sensationalism, but disciplined participation in a reality that is ordered by grace and understood through faith. What emerges from this tradition is a consistent emphasis on responsibility. When death occurs, the response of the living is not passive observation, but active charity. The Church directs that charity primarily through prayer, Mass, penance, and offerings made for the soul of the departed. This is why the early period after death carries such pastoral weight. It is not because something unpredictable is happening, but because the Church recognizes a unique convergence of grief, memory, and intercession that can be directed toward meaningful spiritual aid for the deceased. One of the most serious errors people make when thinking about the spiritual world is assuming that intensity equals truth. If something feels powerful, emotional, or deeply meaningful, it is often treated as automatically authentic, as if the strength of the experience itself guarantees its source. The Catholic tradition has always rejected that assumption because it leads directly into confusion, deception, and spiritual vulnerability. Instead, the Church teaches that spiritual experiences must be tested, not simply felt. This applies whether the experience is interior prayer, extraordinary phenomena, or the perception of a presence that seems to belong to the deceased. The guiding principle is not emotional certainty, but discernment rooted in doctrine and moral fruit. This is where the theological framework developed by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas becomes essential again, because it refuses to reduce spiritual reality to either psychology or superstition. In his treatment of spiritual appearances, Aquinas insists that what is perceived is not always what it appears to be, and that multiple causes can produce similar effects in human experience. He distinguishes carefully between what is permitted by God, what may be mediated by angels, and what may be produced through deception. This distinction is not theoretical detail, but a practical safeguard. Without it, every unusual experience risks being misinterpreted as communication from the dead, which the Church has consistently warned against. The first and most important principle of discernment is doctrinal consistency. Any experience that contradicts the faith, weakens moral clarity, or leads a person away from prayer and the sacraments cannot be considered authentic spiritual guidance. God does not act against his own truth, and therefore no genuine divine permission will result in contradiction. This means that even if an experience feels comforting or meaningful, it must still be measured against what the Church teaches. If the content or effect of the experience leads toward indifference to prayer for the dead, or reduces the urgency of sacramental life, it is already outside the boundaries of authenticity. The second principle is the fruit it produces in the soul. Authentic spiritual encounters, when permitted by God, do not create fascination or curiosity for their own sake. Instead, they create urgency directed toward prayer, repentance, and concrete acts of charity, especially masses offered for the soul in question. This urgency is not chaotic emotion, but structured movement toward the means the Church already provides. The soul is not drawn into speculation about the experience itself, but into deeper participation in intercession. That direction is one of the clearest signs that what is happening is not self-generated imagination. By contrast, experiences that produce obsession, anxiety, or uncontrolled curiosity often point away from authentic spiritual origin. The Church recognizes that deception in the spiritual realm rarely announces itself as harmful. It often imitates urgency or meaning while subtly redirecting the person away from prayer and toward fixation on the phenomenon itself. The third principle is obedience to proper spiritual order. In Catholic understanding, the correct response to any perceived presence of the dead is never dialogue or investigation. The proper response is always prayer, offered to God on behalf of the soul, not communication directed toward the soul itself. This is a crucial boundary because it defines the difference between Catholic intercession and Spiritist practice. The Church permits and encourages prayer for the dead, but it strictly prohibits attempts to contact or interrogate them through human initiative. The direction of movement matters as much as the intention behind it. This is also why practices such as seances, mediumship, and any form of deliberate communication with the dead are consistently condemned. The issue is not whether something may be experienced, but whether the human will is attempting to cross a boundary that belongs to divine initiative alone. The tradition warns that when humans attempt to initiate contact with the dead, they step outside the order of grace and into a domain where deception becomes highly likely. This is not because the dead are absent, but because the proper channels of communion have already been established by God through prayer and the sacraments. In that unauthorized space, the possibility of imitation becomes real. Spiritual tradition consistently holds that deceptive forces can replicate the appearance, voice, knowledge, and emotional tone of deceased persons in order to mislead the living. The danger is not ignorance of the person, but exploitation of attachment to them. This is why emotional sincerity is not a reliable guide in discernment. A person may genuinely desire contact with a loved one and still be misled by experiences that feel authentic. The Church therefore removes subjectivity as the final authority and replaces it with objective criteria rooted in faith. When I experienced the presence of the priest who had died, the immediate response was not analysis or curiosity, but prayer. That response is significant because it aligns with the tradition's expectation of how grace operates when it is authentic. It moves the soul toward intercession, not interpretation. There was no internal suggestion to communicate, no sense of receiving information, and no invitation to engage in dialogue. The entire experience was oriented toward a single response, which was prayer for the soul in question. That simplicity is part of what made the discernment clear. The tradition emphasizes that genuine spiritual movement does not fragment the soul into speculation. It unifies attention toward God and directs action toward established means of grace. Anything that disperses attention into fascination with the phenomenon itself becomes spiritually unstable. Another important aspect of discernment is the absence of self-exaltation. Authentic spiritual experiences, when permitted, do not elevate the person as special, chosen, or uniquely privileged. Instead, they reinforce humility and responsibility, especially in relation to prayer and intercession. If an experience produces pride or a sense of spiritual superiority, the tradition treats that as a warning sign. The focus should always remain on the needs of the soul being prayed for, not on the significance of the person experiencing the phenomenon. This is particularly important because experiences involving death and the unseen world can easily become psychologically powerful. Without grounding, they can distort a person's spiritual imagination, leading them away from ordinary faith into extraordinary fixation. The Church therefore consistently returns to simplicity as a safeguard. Pray for the dead, offer masses, remain faithful to the sacraments, and avoid curiosity-driven engagement with phenomena that are not necessary for salvation. This is the stable center of Catholic pastoral wisdom in this area. At the same time, the Church does not deny that genuine spiritual realities can sometimes become perceptible in extraordinary ways. The communion of saints is not abstract language, but a real participation in the life of grace that includes both the living and the dead in Christ. However, this communion is structured, not chaotic. It operates through prayer, sacrifice, and sacramental life, not through uncontrolled encounters or investigative curiosity. The boundary between communion and contact is therefore essential to preserve. This is why discernment is not optional or secondary, but central to any engagement with experiences that seem to cross the boundary between life and death. Without it, even sincere believers can be led into confusion that undermines their faith instead of strengthening it. When you strip away speculation, emotion, and cultural assumptions, what remains at the center of this entire discussion is responsibility, not curiosity about the unseen, not fascination with what might lie beyond death, but responsibility toward the souls of the dead and the moral seriousness with which the Church approaches that responsibility. Everything I have described leads back to that single point. The experience I had at 3 a.m. cannot be understood in isolation, because isolation always distorts spiritual interpretation. It must be placed inside the framework of Catholic teaching, where death is not disappearance but transition, and where the bond between the living and the dead is not severed but transformed into prayerful communion. The priest who had died 11 days earlier was not present in any physical or observable sense. There was no sensory confirmation, no external proof, and nothing that could be treated as empirical evidence. And yet the awareness of presence was immediate, distinct, and directed towards something very specific that demanded a response rather than analysis. That response, in the moment, was not to investigate what was happening, but to pray. This is significant because Catholic tradition consistently teaches that when confronted with anything that appears to concern the dead, the first and only stable response is intercession. Everything else must come later, and only within discernment. What followed was not interpretation through curiosity, but action through established spiritual means. I arranged for 30 consecutive masses to be offered for the soul of the priest, known in tradition as the Gregorian Masses. This decision was not based on speculation about the nature of the experience, but on the certainty that prayer for the dead is always appropriate. The Church has long held, through tradition associated with Gregory the Great, that sustained offering of the Eucharistic sacrifice for a single soul carries profound spiritual significance. This is not because God requires repetition, but because human participation in grace unfolds within time and discipline. The Mass itself is not symbolic in a purely psychological sense, but the real participation in the sacrifice of Christ. Therefore, when offered for the dead, it applies that infinite merit to a specific soul in need of purification. The Gregorian Masses represent a concentrated form of that intercession, structured over time for spiritual assistance. What mattered most in that moment was not the explanation of the experience, but the clarity of response it demanded. Whether one interprets the presence as a permitted spiritual awareness or as something that must remain mysterious, the proper reaction remains the same: prayer for the soul and trust in divine judgment. This is where modern confusion often re-enters the picture. People want certainty about what exactly they have experienced, but the Church does not center spiritual life on certainty about extraordinary phenomena. It centers it on fidelity to prayer, sacraments, and charity toward the dead. The deeper theological truth is that even if no extraordinary experience had occurred, the responsibility would remain unchanged. Every Catholic is called to pray for the dead, to offer masses, to practice intercession, and to remain conscious that the bond of charity does not end with physical death. This is why the most important part of this entire discussion is not the event itself, but what it reveals about formation. Most Catholics today are not formed to respond to death with urgency in prayer. They are taught grief management, memory, and emotional processing, but not sustained intercession rooted in theology. As a result, even sincere believers often miss what the tradition consistently emphasizes: that the first period after death carries a unique weight in the life of prayer, not because God changes his willingness to act, but because human participation is most immediate and attentive in that period. The tradition speaks of early urgency not to create fear, but to awaken responsibility. When someone dies, the Church does not ask us to step back emotionally alone, but to step forward spiritually through prayer, sacrifice, and the offering of the Mass. That is the proper direction of love. The perception I experienced of need in that moment, whether understood mystically or not, aligned with that same direction. It did not lead toward speculation or private communication. It led toward the most objective and universal act the Church possesses, which is the Eucharistic sacrifice offered for the dead. This is also where discernment becomes crucial one final time. The Church never allows the faithful to shift from prayer into curiosity-driven engagement with the unseen. The boundary is not arbitrary, but protective, because it preserves the soul from deception and confusion. Spiritual tradition consistently warns that the human desire to know more than what is given can become the doorway to distortion. When curiosity replaces prayer, the focus shifts away from God and toward phenomena that are not meant to be controlled or analyzed by human initiative. That is why every authentic movement in this area must return to simplicity. Pray for the dead, offer masses, live in a state of grace, trust the mercy of God. These are not secondary responses, but the foundation of Catholic life in relation to those who have died. Even the most extraordinary experiences, if they are genuine, do not replace this foundation. They only reinforce it. If something draws a person away from prayer for the dead, it is not from God. If it draws them deeper into prayer, it may be permitted within His providence. The priest I knew in life was not someone defined by extraordinary mystical experiences, but by ordinary fidelity to his vocation. That is important, because it reminds us that holiness is not measured by extraordinary phenomena, but by faithfulness in ordinary life. And it is precisely for such souls that the Church offers its most powerful intercession, not because they are lost, but because love does not end at the moment of death. Love continues in prayer, and prayer becomes the language of communion across the boundary of death. When I reflect on that early morning experience, I do not interpret it as something meant to be analyzed endlessly. I interpret it as something that redirected attention to what the Church already teaches with clarity. Pray for the dead, urgently and consistently. Whether or not others interpret such experiences the same way is not the central issue. The central issue is whether we remain faithful to what is always required, regardless of experience. That fidelity is what gives structure to Catholic life in both ordinary and extraordinary circumstances. And that fidelity is also what protects the soul from both extremes of denial and fascination. The dead are not absent from our love, but neither are they accessible to our control. They are entrusted to God, and our role is intercession, not intrusion. This is the point where everything converges: the mystery of death, the reality of judgment, the hope of purification, and the practice of prayer all meet in a single act of charity offered by the living for the dead. That act is Mass, prayer, sacrifice, and trust in divine mercy. What I experienced and what I have described ultimately returns to that same act. It does not expand the boundaries of Catholic teaching. It narrows attention back to its center. Pray for the dead. Offer the sacrifice. Trust God with what you cannot see. And if there is one thing I would leave you with after all of this, it is not fascination with the experience itself, but renewed seriousness about the people you have lost. Because the tradition is not asking you to speculate about them, it is asking you to pray for them. Not someday, not abstractly, but now, while love still has the form of prayer and time still allows intercession to be offered.